high in the mist-shrouded peaks of the Andes, where the air grows thin and the silence speaks in whispers, there begins a story that stretches across centuries like golden thread woven through the fabric of time. It is a tale of mountains that touch the sky, of stones fitted so perfectly that not even the breath of wind can slip between them, and of a people who built an empire that glowed like the sun itself across the spine of South America. Listen now, as the evening settles around you, to the gentle murmur of ancient streams that still flow through terraced valleys, carrying with them the memory of voices that once echoed through these sacred peaks. The story we unfold tonight is one of rise and fall, of glory and sorrow, told in the soft cadence of wind through mountain passes and the patient whisper of time itself. In the beginning, when the world was young and the mountains were still learning their names, the Andean peoples spoke of creation in hushed tones around fires that flickered like captured stars. They told of Viracocha, the great creator god who emerged from the depths of Lake Titicaca, that mirror of sky nestled between snow-capped peaks where the water reflects clouds so perfectly that earth and heaven seem to merge into one endless dream. From these sacred waters, the legend whispers, Viracocha called forth the sun and moon, setting them on their eternal dance across a dome of sky. With hands that shaped like potter's clay, he molded the first people from stone, breathing life into their forms before sending them forth to populate the world. Some he placed beneath the earth, others in caves and springs, and still others upon mountain peaks, each group destined to emerge at the appointed time to claim their place beneath the great condor's wing. The high plateaus of the Andes had known human footsteps for thousands of years before our story properly begins. Through these windswept grasslands called the Altiplano, where vicuñas moved like graceful spirits, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with ancient magic, indigenous peoples had learned to read the language of seasons and stars. They cultivated potatoes in hundreds of varieties, each one a small miracle of adaptation to the harsh mountain climate. And they domesticated the llama and alpaca, those gentle creatures whose warm wool would protect against the bite of highland cold. These early peoples built their settlements where the land offered its gifts most generously, near streams that sang with snowmelt, on terraces carved into mountainsides like great stone steps ascending toward the realm of the gods. They learned to work with gold and silver, those metals that seem to hold sunlight and moonlight within their gleaming surfaces. And they created textiles so fine that Spanish chroniclers would later compare them to silk. But it was around the year 1200, when the medieval world elsewhere was building its cathedrals and the Mongol Empire was stretching across distant continents, that a small tribe emerged in the fertile valley of Cusco, nestled among peaks that stood like ancient guardians around a bowl of green earth. These people called themselves the Inca, a word that would in time become synonymous with one of the most remarkable civilizations the world has ever known. The valley of Cusco lay like a secret hidden in the embrace of the mountains, its soil dark and rich, watered by streams that descended from glacial heights like veins carrying the lifeblood of the earth. Here, where the air was sweet with the scent of native flowers and the climate gentle enough for maize to ripen golden in the fields, a legend was taking root that would grow into an empire. According to the sacred stories that mothers would whisper to their children as firelight danced on adobe walls, the first Inca ruler was Manco Capac, a figure who walks the borderland between history and myth, like morning mist between mountain and valley. The chroniclers tell us he appeared as if from the very stones themselves, emerging with his sister wife Mama Oklo from a cave at Pacaritambo, the place of origin, carrying with him a golden staff given by his father, the sun god Inti. Manco Capac was said to possess the wisdom of the mountains and the warmth of the sun in his veins. With his golden rod, he tested the earth as he traveled, seeking the place where the staff would sink deep into the soil, a sign that here the earth itself welcomed his presence. When at last the rod disappeared entirely into the fertile ground of Cusco Valley, he knew he had found the center of the world, the navel of creation itself, which they would call Cusco in their own tongue, meaning navel or center. Here, in this blessed valley, Manco Capac established the first royal household and began to teach the scattered tribes the arts of civilization. He showed them how to build with stone, how to terrace the hillsides for farming, how to weave fine cloth and work precious metals. His wife Mama Oklo taught the women to spin and prepare food, to raise children with wisdom and reverence for the sacred order of the world. The early Inca state was small, perhaps controlling no more than the valley of Cusco itself, but already it bore the seeds of something extraordinary. The rulers claimed divine descent from Inti, the sun god, whose golden face blessed the earth each dawn, and from this sacred connection flowed their authority to order the world according to cosmic harmony. They divided their realm into 4 quarters, Tawantinsuyu, the land of 4 quarters, with Cusco at the center, like the hub of a great wheel. For generations, the descendants of Manco Capac expanded their influence slowly, village by village, valley by valley, always maintaining the delicate balance between persuasion and force that would become the hallmark of Inca statecraft. They offered their neighbors the benefits of their superior organization, better farming techniques, protection from enemies, participation in religious ceremonies that connected earth to sky, and most found the offer too attractive to refuse. Under rulers whose names have faded into whispers, Sinchiroca, Yoke-Yupanqui, Maita Capac, the Inca domain grew like ripples spreading across the surface of a mountain pool. Each generation built upon the achievements of the last, developing the administrative systems and engineering skills that would later allow them to govern an empire stretching from present-day Colombia to Chile. The Inca understood something profound about power that many conquerors throughout history have missed. True strength comes not from destroying what came before, but from weaving new threads into the existing tapestry of life. When they encountered other peoples, they studied their customs, their gods, their ways of farming and building, the useful innovations they absorbed into their own system, the powerful local deities they invited to join the Inca pantheon as honored guests, rather than conquered subjects. This approach created a civilization of remarkable diversity, unified by common threads of administration, religion, and mutual obligation. The Inca system of Mital, rotating labor service, ensured that great public works could be accomplished while allowing communities to maintain their traditional ways of life. In return for their service, the people received protection, food in times of scarcity, and participation in festivals where the very fabric of society was renewed through shared celebration. But the true transformation of the Inca from a small Andean kingdom into a continental empire began in the early 15th century during the reign of the ninth Sapa Inca, Pachacuti Inca Yupanqui, whose name means earthquake or overturner of the world. He inherited a realm under siege, threatened by the aggressive expansion of the Chanca Confederation from the northwest, and he could have presided over the collapse of everything his ancestors had built. Instead, Pachacuti became the architect of greatness, transforming not just the political structure of his empire, but reimagining the very relationship between human society and the sacred landscape of the Andes. Under his rule, which lasted from approximately 1438 to 1471, the Inca would begin their meteoric rise to become the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas. The crisis that made Pachacuti's greatness possible came when he was still a prince. The Chanca armies had swept down from their mountain strongholds, overwhelming Inca defenses and advancing to within sight of Cusco itself. The aging Sapa Inca Viracocha, along with his designated heir, fled the capital in panic, leaving the city to its fate. But Prince Cusi Yupanqui, as Pachacuti was then known, refused to abandon the sacred center of the world. Standing in the great square of Cusco, as enemy warriors gathered like storm clouds on the surrounding hills, the young prince called upon the very stones of the earth to aid him. Legend says that the rocks themselves rose up to fight beside the Inca warriors, transforming into fierce soldiers called Pururaucas, who helped drive back the Chanca forces. Whether through divine intervention or the prince's own tactical brilliance and the loyalty he inspired in his people, the siege was broken and the Chanca threat eliminated forever. This victory marked the true beginning of Inca imperial expansion, but more importantly, it established Pachacuti's vision of his people as chosen by the gods to bring order and civilization to the entire world. He understood that the mountains themselves had endorsed his rule, and he set about rebuilding not just his army, but the very conception of what the Inca Empire could become. Pachacuti began by completely reconstructing Cusco according to a grand design that reflected the cosmic order itself. The city was laid out in the shape of a puma, with the fortress of Sacsayhuaman forming the head and the confluence of the Huatanay and Tulumayo rivers marking the tail. Sacred districts were established for different aspects of religious and administrative life, with the Coricancha, the golden enclosure dedicated to Inti, at the very heart of the design. The Coricancha was a marvel that would inspire awe in all who entered its precincts. Its walls were lined with sheets of finest gold, and its gardens contained golden cornstalks with silver leaves, golden llamas, and golden replicas of every creature that lived in the empire. Here, the mummified remains of previous rulers sat on golden thrones, consulted as oracles, and treated as living presences who continue to guide their people from beyond the veil of death. But Pachacuti's genius extended far beyond magnificent architecture. He recognized that an empire built on conquest alone would crumble like a building constructed on sand. Instead, he developed a system of governance that honored local traditions while binding diverse peoples together through shared participation in imperial ceremonies and common obligations to the state. The cornerstone of this system was the concept of reciprocity that flowed like mountain streams through every level of Inca society. The Sapa Inca owed protection and sustenance to his subjects. In return, they owed him their labor and loyalty. Local chiefs maintained their authority over their own people in exchange for acknowledgement of imperial sovereignty. Even the gods participated in this network of mutual obligation, providing good harvests and protection from natural disasters in return for proper ceremonies and offerings. Under Pachacuti's rule, the Inca army became a force unlike any other in the pre-Columbian Americas. It was not merely a tool of conquest, but an instrument of integration, skilled in the arts of engineering and administration as well as warfare. When Inca forces entered a new territory, they came prepared not just to defeat enemies, but to immediately begin the work of incorporating the conquered region into the imperial system. Road builders and architects accompanied the soldiers, ready to begin construction of the infrastructure that would bind the new territory to the rest of the empire. Agricultural specialists studied local farming techniques and began planning improvements. Priests learned the names and attributes of local deities, preparing to welcome them into the expanding Inca pantheon. Administrative officials began the delicate work of integrating local chiefs into the imperial hierarchy while respecting traditional patterns of authority. The expansion under Pachacuti was methodical and inexorable, spreading outward from Cusco like the rays of the sun at dawn. To the south, Inca armies advanced through the high plateau country around Lake Titicaca, incorporating the ancient kingdoms of Colla and Lupaca, whose peoples had for centuries revered the sacred waters where Viracocha first emerged. To the north, they pushed through the difficult mountain passes toward Cajamarca and beyond, bringing their system of terraced agriculture and centralized administration to peoples who had previously lived in small, isolated communities. Perhaps most remarkably, the Inca expansion proceeded with remarkably little destruction of existing culture and infrastructure. Rather than burning cities and slaughtering populations as many conquerors have done throughout history, the Inca typically incorporated existing settlements into their own system, often improving them with better buildings, roads, and agricultural facilities. Local artisans found their skills in demand for imperial projects. Local priests discovered their deities welcomed into the Inca pantheon. Local leaders often found themselves with greater authority and responsibilities than they had possessed before. This was conquest by seduction as much as by force, and it proved remarkably effective. The benefits of Inca rule: protection from enemies, insurance against famine, participation in magnificent festivals, access to goods from across the empire, often outweighed the costs of imperial taxation and labor obligations. Many communities actively sought incorporation into the empire, sending delegations to Cusco to request the privilege of becoming Inca subjects. But Pachacuti's most lasting legacy may have been his recognition that empire must be built not just on administrative efficiency, but on shared meaning and purpose. He understood that people needed to feel themselves part of something greater than their own small communities, connected to a cosmic order that gave significance to their daily labors and sufferings. To achieve this, Pachacuti developed what we might call the Inca civil religion, a system of beliefs and practices that honored local traditions while binding all subjects together in common worship of imperial deities. At the center of this system stood Inti, the sun god, whose golden face blessed all peoples equally and whose divine light was embodied in the person of the Sapa Inca himself. But Inti did not stand alone in the Inca pantheon. Beside him stood Mama Killa, the moon goddess who governed the cycles of fertility and agricultural abundance. Below them ranged a host of sacred beings. The Apu spirits who dwelt in mountain peaks and protected local communities. The Huacas that resided in springs, rocks, and other sacred places. The Malaki, or ancestor spirits, who continued to watch over their descendants from their mummified resting places. This religious system created a sacred geography that unified the diverse landscapes of the empire. Every mountain peak, every sacred spring, every ancient burial ground became part of a vast network of holy places connected by invisible lines of spiritual force called tseques that radiated outward from Cusco like the threads of a cosmic spiderweb. Pilgrims traveled these sacred pathways, carrying offerings from their home communities to distant shrines and returning with blessings that renewed the spiritual bonds holding the empire together. The great festivals that punctuated the Inca calendar, Inti Raymi celebrating the winter solstice, Caput Raymi marking the summer solstice, Quichua for purification and renewal, became occasions when people from throughout the empire could experience their shared identity as children of the sun. These celebrations lasted for days, featuring processions of mummified rulers, elaborate sacrificial ceremonies, competitive displays of music and dance, and massive communal feasts where the Sapa Inca demonstrated his generosity by feeding thousands of his subjects. During Pachacuti's reign, these festivals became increasingly elaborate and inclusive, drawing participants from newly conquered territories who returned to their homes with stories of the magnificence and generosity of their imperial rulers. The psychological impact of these celebrations was profound, creating emotional bonds between subject and sovereign that no amount of military force could have achieved. When Pachacuti died in 1471, after more than 3 decades of transformative rule, he left behind an empire that had grown from a small Andean kingdom to a realm stretching from the Titicaca Basin to the Pacific coast. But more importantly, he had created the institutional and ideological foundations upon which his successors could build one of the most remarkable political achievements in human history. His son and successor, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, inherited not just expanded territories, but a proven system for incorporating new peoples and a professional military and administrative apparatus capable of governing vast distances and diverse populations. Under the new Sapa Inca's rule, which lasted from 1471 to 1493, the empire would complete its expansion along the Pacific coast and push deep into the Amazon basin, creating a realm that encompassed virtually every ecological zone that South America had to offer. The name Tupac Inca Yupanqui means royal Inca who is memorable, and he certainly lived up to that designation. Where his father had been primarily concerned with establishing the foundations of empire, Tupac Inca became the great conqueror, pushing Inca frontiers to their ultimate limits while perfecting the administrative systems that allowed such a vast realm to function as a unified whole. The campaigns of Tupac Inca Yupanqui read like an epic poem written in mountain stone and coastal sand. To the north, his armies advanced through the difficult terrain of present-day Ecuador, incorporating the sophisticated kingdom of Quito with its skilled metalworkers and textile artisans. These campaigns required tremendous logistical sophistication, as Inca forces had to be supplied and commanded across distances that stretched the empire's administrative capabilities to their limits. The conquest of the northern territories brought the Inca into contact with peoples whose technologies and artistic traditions were often as advanced as their own. The metalworkers of Ecuador produced gold and silver objects of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication. Their weavers created textiles using techniques unknown in Cusco. Their architects had developed distinctive building styles adapted to different climatic conditions. Rather than imposing Inca styles and techniques throughout these new territories, Tupac Inca's administrators showed remarkable flexibility in adapting imperial systems to local conditions, while encouraging the exchange of knowledge and techniques between different regions of the empire. Quito became a major imperial center, with its own royal palaces and administrative buildings, but these structures incorporated local architectural traditions alongside imported Inca elements. The southward expansion under Tupac Inca was equally dramatic, pushing Inca control through the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places on Earth, and into the fertile valleys of central Chile. These campaigns demonstrated the Inca military machine at its most sophisticated, as armies had to be supplied across hundreds of miles of desert terrain, where water sources were few and far between. The logistics of these desert campaigns required the construction of way stations at precise intervals along the coastal roads, each one equipped with stored supplies and fresh water. Message runners trained to cover enormous distances at high speed carried communications between the advancing armies and their supply bases. Engineers accompanying the military forces immediately began construction of the roads and administrative centers that would permanently incorporate new territories into the imperial system. But perhaps most remarkable was Tupac Inca's expansion eastward into the Amazon basin, a region that presented challenges entirely different from those encountered in the mountains and deserts. The dense tropical forests, with their bewildering diversity of plant and animal life, their seasonal flooding, and their scattered indigenous populations, required military and administrative techniques unlike anything the Inca had previously developed. The peoples of the Amazon, skilled in river navigation, hunting, and the cultivation of tropical crops, possessed knowledge that complemented rather than competed with highland Inca traditions. The feathers of tropical birds became prized materials for imperial ceremonial costumes. Medicinal plants from the forest entered the Inca pharmacopoeia. Techniques for working with different types of wood and plant fibers expanded the range of imperial crafts. These eastern campaigns also brought the Inca into contact with the vast river systems that drained the eastern slopes of the Andes, opening up new possibilities for transportation and communication. While the Inca never became a riverine civilization like some Amazonian peoples, they did learn to use these waterways to move goods and people across distances that would have been nearly impossible to traverse on foot. Throughout all these campaigns, Tupac Inca maintained the Inca tradition of conquest through integration rather than destruction. Local chiefs, who submitted voluntarily, were confirmed in their positions and often given additional responsibilities within the imperial system. Artisans and specialists were relocated to where their skills were most needed, but they were well compensated for their services and often found their social status enhanced by their connection to imperial projects. The most visible legacy of Tupac Inca's reign was the completion of the Inca road system, that marvel of pre-Columbian engineering that bound the empire together like arteries, carrying the lifeblood of administration and communication. These roads, totaling over 25,000 miles in length, crossed some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, including snow-covered mountain passes over 16,000 feet above sea level, coastal deserts where water was available only at widely scattered oases, and tropical forests where the very air seemed thick with moisture and life. The engineering challenges overcome in building this road system were extraordinary by any standard. In the mountains, roads were carved into cliff faces and supported by retaining walls built of precisely fitted stones. Suspension bridges woven from vegetable fibers spanned chasms hundreds of feet deep, their cables anchored to massive stone towers built into the living rock. In swampy areas, causeways were constructed on foundations of carefully layered stones and earth that would not sink into the soft ground. But the roads were more than just engineering marvels. They were the nervous system of the empire, carrying not just people and goods, but information and authority. Along these routes, at intervals of approximately 1 day's journey, stood the tambos, way stations where travelers could rest, resupply, and exchange pack animals. These facilities were maintained by local communities as part of their mitar obligations, but the imperial government provided detailed specifications for their construction and operation. The most remarkable feature of the road system was the chasqui relay network. Teams of trained runners who could carry messages across the entire length of the empire in a matter of days. These runners, stationed at intervals of about 2 miles, could maintain a pace that allowed urgent communications to travel from Cusco to Quito, a distance of over 1,200 miles, in less than a week. By comparison, it would take the Spanish colonial postal system several months to cover the same distance. The chasqui system demonstrates the Inca genius for organization and their understanding that information was power. Each runner was responsible for memorizing not just verbal messages, but complex sets of numerical data encoded in quipu, bundles of knotted strings that served as the Inca equivalent of written records. These remarkable devices could record everything from census data and tribute obligations to historical chronicles and religious texts. The quipu represents one of the most intriguing aspects of Inca civilization. Their ability to maintain detailed administrative records and preserve complex information without developing what we would recognize as a writing system. Each quipu consisted of a main cord, from which hung numerous subsidiary strings of different colors, with various types of knots tied at specific positions to encode different types of information. The interpretation of quipu required specialized training, and professional quipica mayoks, keepers of the knots, formed an essential part of the imperial bureaucracy. These specialists could read quipu with the same fluency that literate people read books, and they maintained vast archives where the administrative records of the empire were stored. Some scholars believe that quipu may have been capable of recording not just numerical data, but actual language, making them a unique form of three-dimensional writing. During Tupac Inca's reign, the quipu system reached its highest level of development, with standardized protocols for recording different types of information, and a professional class of specialists responsible for maintaining records throughout the empire. This system allowed the central government in Cusco to maintain detailed knowledge of conditions in the most remote provinces, tracking everything from agricultural production and population changes to the loyalty of local officials. The agricultural achievements of the Inca under Tupac Inca were equally remarkable. The empire's engineers perfected techniques for terracing steep mountain slopes, creating agricultural land in places where conventional farming would have been impossible. These terraces, called andines, were marvels of engineering that often required moving thousands of tons of soil and stone to create level planting surfaces supported by massive retaining walls. The construction of agricultural terraces was always a community effort, with entire villages cooperating in projects that might take years to complete, but would provide increased food security for generations. The Inca understanding of soil management, drainage, and crop rotation allowed these terraces to remain productive for centuries. Many are still in use today, testament to the sophistication of Inca agricultural engineering. But the Inca were not content simply to farm the land more efficiently. They also worked to improve the crops themselves. Through careful selection and breeding, they developed hundreds of varieties of potatoes, each one adapted to specific climatic conditions and altitudes. They created new strains of maize that could ripen at higher elevations than ever before. They improved the nutritional value and storage characteristics of quinoa, beans, and other highland crops. This agricultural innovation was systematically spread throughout the empire, with successful techniques developed in one region being shared with others through the movement of specialists and the exchange of seeds and breeding stock. The result was a steady increase in agricultural productivity that could support larger populations and free up labor for the monumental construction projects that were the visible symbols of Inca power. The storage and distribution of agricultural surpluses was another area where Inca organization excelled. Throughout the empire, networks of storehouses called colcas were built to hold reserves of food, textiles, and other necessities. These facilities were carefully designed to protect their contents from moisture, insects, and rodents, with sophisticated ventilation systems that maintained optimal conditions for long-term storage. The colca system served multiple purposes within the Inca economy. In years of good harvests, surplus production was stored against future shortages. During military campaigns, armies could be supplied from strategically located storehouses without disrupting local food supplies. In times of natural disaster, imperial reserves could be distributed to affected communities. The psychological impact of this system was enormous, as it provided ordinary people with security against the uncertainties of life in a challenging environment. By the time of Tupac Inca's death in 1493, the empire had reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching over 2,500 miles from north to south, and encompassing a population estimated at between 6 and 12 million people. This vast realm included virtually every climate zone and ecological niche that South America had to offer, from tropical rainforests to high mountain glaciers, from coastal deserts to temperate grasslands. But the true measure of Tupac Inca's achievement was not just the size of the empire, but its internal cohesion and stability. Despite encompassing hundreds of different ethnic groups, speaking dozens of languages, and following diverse cultural traditions, the empire functioned as a unified whole. Trade goods moved freely along the imperial roads. Religious festivals were celebrated simultaneously throughout the realm. Administrative directives issued in Cusco were implemented effectively in the most distant provinces. This unity was achieved not through cultural homogenization, but through what we might call orchestrated diversity. Local traditions were preserved and honored within an overarching imperial framework. Different regions specialized in producing the goods for which they were best suited, creating economic interdependencies that strengthened political bonds. Cultural exchange was encouraged, leading to artistic and technological innovations that benefited the entire empire. The transition of power from Tupac Inca to his son Huayna Capac was smooth and uncontested, testimony to the stability of the imperial institutions that had been developed over the previous century. Huayna Capac, whose name means rich in youth, inherited an empire at the height of its power and prosperity, but he also inherited the challenge of governing a realm that had perhaps reached the practical limits of expansion, given the transportation and communication technologies available at the time. The reign of Huayna Capac, from 1493 to 1525, represents the golden age of Inca civilization, when the empire's institutions functioned at their highest level of effectiveness and its cultural achievements reached their peak. But it was also during this period that the first harbingers of catastrophe began to appear on the horizon, though their significance would not become clear until it was too late to respond effectively. Huayna Capac was by all accounts a remarkable ruler, combining the military genius of his father with administrative skills that allowed him to consolidate and perfect the imperial system. Under his rule, the arts and sciences flourished as never before. The great fortress of Sacsayhuaman, overlooking Cusco, was completed. Its massive stones fitted together with such precision that the joints between them are nearly invisible. The capital city itself was rebuilt according to an even grander design, with palaces and temples that amazed all who saw them. But perhaps Huayna Capac's greatest achievement was his development of what we might call the Inca imperial style, a distinctive approach to architecture, art, and urban planning that combined functionality with symbolic meaning in ways that proclaimed the power and benevolence of imperial rule. This style was characterized by massive stone construction using precisely fitted blocks, trapezoidal doorways, and windows that could withstand earthquakes, and integration with the natural landscape that made Inca buildings seem like natural outgrowths of the mountain terrain. The symbolic elements of Inca imperial architecture were equally important. Buildings were oriented according to astronomical alignments that connected earthly structures with cosmic cycles. Sacred spaces were designed to frame views of the important mountains or other natural features that held religious significance. The proportions and decorative elements of imperial buildings were carefully calculated to inspire awe and reverence while proclaiming the divine authority of the Sapa Inca. During Huayna Capac's reign, this imperial style was perfected and standardized throughout the empire. New administrative centers built in distant provinces followed architectural principles developed in Cusco, creating a visual unity that reinforced political integration. Local building traditions were not suppressed, but were incorporated into hybrid styles that honored both imperial authority and regional identity. The artistic achievements of this period extended far beyond architecture. Inca metalworkers created objects of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication, working gold and silver with techniques that were not equaled in Europe until much later. Their textiles were so fine that Spanish conquistadors compared them favorably with the best European silks. Their ceramics combined functional excellence with decorative beauty, often incorporating symbolic elements that carried religious or political meanings. But it was perhaps in the realm of engineering that Inca achievements reached their most impressive heights during Huayna Capus's reign. The completion of the road system linked every corner of the empire with transportation networks that were not surpassed anywhere in the world until the coming of the railroad. Water management systems brought irrigation to desert areas and controlled flooding in low-lying regions. Urban planning created cities that were marvels of organization and public health. The crown jewel of Inca engineering achievement was probably Machu Picchu, that extraordinary complex perched on a narrow ridge high above the Urubamba River. Built during Huayna Capac's reign as a royal retreat and religious center, Machu Picchu represents the pinnacle of Inca architectural and engineering skill. Its buildings seem to grow organically from the mountain itself, their walls following the natural contours of the ridge, while their foundations are anchored deep into the living rock. The site of Machu Picchu was chosen with careful attention to both practical and symbolic considerations. Its location provided spectacular views of the surrounding peaks, many of which were sacred Apu spirits in the Inca pantheon. Its position high above the river valley offered security and privacy for royal ceremonies. Its orientation was carefully calculated to align with astronomical events that were important in the Inca calendar. The construction of Machu Picchu required extraordinary logistical planning and engineering skill. Every stone had to be quarried from nearby sites and moved into position using only human labor and simple tools. The terraces that provided level building sites had to be carved from the steep mountainside and supported with massive retaining walls. Water had to be brought to the site through a sophisticated system of channels and fountains that still functions perfectly today. But Machu Picchu was more than just an engineering marvel. It was a sacred landscape designed to facilitate communion between human beings and the divine forces that govern the universe. Its temples were positioned to frame views of sacred mountains and to catch the light of the sun at significant moments in the ritual calendar. Its plazas provided spaces for ceremonies that connected the microcosm of human society with the macrocosm of cosmic order. The religious life of the empire under Huayna Capac reached levels of sophistication and integration that bound together peoples from radically different cultural backgrounds. The great festivals became occasions when representatives from throughout the empire gathered in Cusco to participate in ceremonies that renewed the spiritual bonds holding the realm together. These celebrations required months of preparation and involved thousands of participants in elaborate displays of music, dance, and ritual. The most important of these festivals was Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun, celebrated at the winter solstice when the sun was at its most distant point and needed to be encouraged to return with its life-giving warmth. For days before the festival, delegations from throughout the empire converged on Cusco, bringing gifts for the sun god and representatives of their local deities who would participate in the grand ceremony. On the day of the festival itself, the entire city became a stage for rituals that linked human society with cosmic order. The mummified remains of previous Sapa Incas were brought from their resting places and arranged in the Great Square, where they were treated as living presences who continued to guide their people. The current Sapa Inca, dressed in robes of finest gold and surrounded by the symbols of his divine authority, presided over ceremonies that lasted from dawn to dusk. The climax of Inti Raymi came when the Sapa Inca raised a golden cup filled with chicha, corn beer, toward the rising sun and invited Inti to drink. As the rulers sipped from the cup, the assembled thousands understood that they were witnessing direct communication between the Divine Father and his earthly Son. The psychological impact of this moment, when human and divine seemed to merge in the person of the Sapa Inca, was profound and lasting. But the religious life of the empire extended far beyond these great public festivals. Every community had its own cycle of ceremonies that marked the passage of seasons and the agricultural calendar. Every household maintained its own shrines to ancestor spirits and local deities. Every individual participated in personal rituals that connected them with the sacred forces that governed their daily lives. This religious system provided more than just spiritual comfort. It was the ideological foundation that legitimized imperial authority and motivated individual sacrifice for collective benefit. When people contributed their labor to imperial projects, they understood themselves to be participating in sacred work that maintained cosmic harmony. When they paid taxes or performed military service, they were fulfilling obligations to divine authority embodied in the person of the Sapa Inca. The educational system that developed during Huayna Capac's reign was designed to perpetuate these beliefs while providing the technical skills necessary for imperial administration. The sons of nobles from throughout the empire were brought to Cusco for education in imperial schools where they learned Quechua, the official language of the empire, along with the principles of administration, the interpretation of Quipu records, and the religious beliefs that bound the empire together. These young men returned to their home provinces as imperial officials, carrying with them loyalty to the Sapa Inca, an understanding of imperial systems. But they also maintained connections to their local communities, serving as bridges between imperial authority and regional traditions. This system created a class of provincial administrators who were personally invested in the success of the imperial system, while remaining sensitive to local needs and concerns. The economic prosperity of the empire under Huayna Capac was remarkable by any standard. The combination of expanded agricultural production, efficient distribution systems, and specialized manufacturing created levels of material well-being that were probably higher than those enjoyed anywhere else in the Americas at that time. The imperial workshops of Cusco produced goods of extraordinary quality that were distributed throughout the empire as rewards for loyal service and symbols of imperial favor. Master weavers created textiles so fine that individual threads were nearly invisible to the naked eye, their patterns incorporating symbolic elements that told stories of imperial history and religious belief. Metalworkers fashioned objects of gold and silver that captured and reflected light in ways that seemed almost magical to those who saw them. But this prosperity was not limited to the imperial capital. Throughout the empire, local communities benefited from imperial investment in infrastructure and agricultural improvement. Terraced fields increased crop yields. Improved storage facilities reduced losses to spoilage and pests. Better roads allowed communities to specialize in producing goods for which they were particularly well suited, trading their surpluses for products from other regions. The system of redistributive exchange that governed the imperial economy ensured that the benefits of this prosperity were shared relatively widely. Local chiefs who demonstrated loyalty and competence were rewarded with prestige goods and additional authority. Skilled artisans found their talents in demand for imperial projects that brought them status and material benefits. Even ordinary farmers and herders participated in the imperial economy through the mita system, which provided them with access to goods and experiences that would have been impossible in their isolated communities. Yet even as the empire reached these heights of prosperity and cultural achievement, subtle signs of strain were beginning to appear. The very success of imperial expansion created administrative challenges that tested the limits of existing systems. The incorporation of new territories with different cultural traditions required increasing flexibility and sensitivity from imperial officials. The maintenance of the vast road system and storage networks required ever greater investments of labor and resources. More ominously, reports began to reach Cusco of strange occurrences in the northern provinces. Ships with white sails had been sighted off the coast, carrying men whose appearance and behavior were utterly unlike anything in Inca experience. These strangers possessed weapons that made sounds like thunder and could kill at distances far greater than any spear or arrow. They rode upon strange beasts that seemed to be four-legged men, creatures that no one in the empire had ever seen before. These reports filtered through the Shasky relay system, reached Huayna Capac as fragments of incomprehensible information. The Kipkamayos who interpreted these messages struggled to find categories within their existing knowledge that could make sense of what they were hearing. Ships were known to coastal peoples, but these vessels were far larger than anything in local experience. Weapons that made thunder sounds existed in no cultural tradition. Four-legged beings that could be ridden like llamas, but were far larger and more powerful, challenged basic assumptions about the natural world. Huayna Capac consulted the oracles and performed divination ceremonies seeking guidance from the gods about the meaning of these strange reports. The omens were disturbing but ambiguous. Some suggested that the time of great changes was approaching, but whether these changes would bring benefit or disaster remained unclear. The emperor ordered increased vigilance along the coastal provinces and strengthened the garrisons of northern fortresses, but without clear understanding of the threat, effective preparation was impossible. The first direct contact between Inca subjects and European explorers occurred in 1526, when Francisco Pizarro's second voyage of exploration brought Spanish ships into contact with Inca trading vessels off the coast of present-day Ecuador. The encounter was brief and largely peaceful, consisting mainly of an exchange of goods that left both sides curious about the other, but without clear understanding of what they had experienced. From the Spanish perspective, this encounter provided their first concrete evidence that a wealthy and sophisticated civilization existed somewhere in the interior of South America. The quality of the textiles, metalwork, and other goods they obtained from the Inca traders suggested levels of craftsmanship that could only be supported by a complex society with accumulated wealth and specialized manufacturing. The reports they received of great cities and vast territories ruled by a powerful emperor convinced them that they had discovered a prize worthy of the risks involved in attempting conquest. From the Inca perspective, the encounter was puzzling, but not immediately alarming. The strangers' goods were interesting but not revolutionary. Iron tools that were harder than copper or bronze, glass beads that were pretty but no more beautiful than turquoise or gold, cloth that was well made but not superior to the finest Inca textiles. The strangers themselves seemed to be humans, albeit with strange appearances and customs. rather than supernatural beings or demons. But what the Inca observers could not understand was the revolutionarily different worldview that these strangers brought with them. The Spanish came from a culture that viewed conquest and the accumulation of wealth as natural and admirable activities. They possessed technologies, steel weapons, gunpowder, horses, writing, that gave them overwhelming advantages in certain types of conflict. Most importantly, they carried with them diseases to which the peoples of the Americas had no immunity. Invisible weapons that would prove more devastating than all their swords and cannons combined. As reports of these encounters filtered back to Cusco through the Chasqui system, Huayna Capac found himself facing a strategic dilemma unlike any that previous Sapa Incas had confronted. The empire's traditional methods of dealing with external threats, diplomatic negotiation backed by overwhelming military force, seemed inadequate when the nature of the threat itself remained unclear. Should these strangers be treated as potential trading partners, possible allies, dangerous enemies, or something else entirely? The emperor's response was characteristic of Inca statecraft at its most sophisticated. Rather than rushing to military confrontation or dismissing the strangers as unimportant, he initiated a careful intelligence-gathering effort designed to learn as much as possible about these newcomers before deciding how to deal with them. Trusted officials were dispatched to the coastal provinces with orders to observe and report on any further contacts. The best interpreters and diplomats in the empire were prepared for possible negotiations. Military commanders were instructed to assess the strangers' fighting capabilities while avoiding provocation. But while Huayna Capac was preparing to deal with the external challenge posed by Spanish explorers, an even more devastating threat was already spreading through his empire. European diseases, carried by the first contacts between Spanish and Inca trading vessels, began to spread through indigenous populations that had no resistance to these new pathogens. Smallpox, typhus, measles, and other diseases raced along the same trade routes and communication networks that had been the empire's greatest strengths, turning the very systems that bound the realm together into vectors for catastrophe. The impact of these epidemics was beyond anything in previous Inca experience. Entire communities were wiped out within weeks. The carefully maintained agricultural systems that supported the empire's population began to break down as workers died faster than they could be replaced. The administrative apparatus that governed the empire was disrupted as officials and their trained assistants succumbed to diseases they could neither understand nor combat. Most tragically, the epidemic struck hardest at the very heart of the imperial system. In 1525, while campaigning in the northern provinces, Huayna Capac himself fell victim to what was probably smallpox, dying within days of the onset of symptoms. With him died his designated heir and many of the most experienced administrators and military commanders in the empire. The sophisticated succession procedures that had ensured smooth transitions of power for generations were thrown into chaos by the sudden deaths of so many key figures. The death of Huayna Capac marked the beginning of the end for the Inca Empire, though few at the time could have understood the full implications of what was happening. The immediate crisis was the question of succession, which under normal circumstances would have been resolved quickly according to established procedures. But these were not normal circumstances, and the traditional mechanisms of imperial governance were straining under pressures they had never been designed to handle. two of Huayna Capac's sons emerged as claimants to the imperial throne. Huascar, who had been governing the southern provinces from Cusco, and Atahualpa, who had been commanding military forces in the north alongside his dying father. Both were legitimate heirs according to Inca law, and both had powerful supporters within the imperial hierarchy. Under different circumstances, such a dispute might have been resolved through negotiation and compromise, but the disruption caused by the epidemics had weakened the institutional mechanisms that normally prevented succession crises from escalating into civil wars. The conflict that erupted between Huascar and Atahualpa was more than just a dynastic dispute. It represented a fundamental crisis in the ideological foundations of Inca rule. The Sapa Inca derived his authority from his claim to be the direct descendant and earthly representative of Inti, the sun god. When two equally legitimate claimants asserted this divine connection simultaneously, the very basis of imperial authority was called into question. Huascar, as the elder brother who had been governing from the traditional capital of Cusco, initially seemed to have the stronger claim. He controlled the religious and administrative heart of the empire and had the support of the traditional nobility, who had served as the backbone of imperial government for generations. His coronation in the great square of Cusco, surrounded by the mummified remains of previous emperors and conducted according to ancient rituals, appeared to confirm his legitimacy as the rightful heir. But Atahualpa possessed advantages that proved crucial in the struggle that followed. He commanded the loyalty of the empire's most experienced military units, hardened by campaigns in the difficult northern territories, where his father had been fighting to consolidate Inca control. His officers were practical men who valued competence and effectiveness over traditional legitimacy. Most importantly, he had inherited his father's understanding that the empire faced external threats that required military expertise rather than ceremonial authority. The civil war that raged between these brothers from 1525 to 1532 was a catastrophe that weakened the empire far more than any external enemy could have done. Armies that should have been defending imperial frontiers were instead fighting each other across the heartland of the realm. Resources that should have been devoted to maintaining the infrastructure of imperial administration were consumed in destructive warfare. The psychological bonds of loyalty and reciprocity that held the empire together were strained to the breaking point as different regions were forced to choose sides in a conflict that set brother against brother and father against son. The military campaigns of this civil war demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of the Inca military system. When Inca armies fought against external enemies, their superior organization, equipment, and tactics usually ensured victory. But when equally well-trained and equipped Inca forces fought against each other, battles could be prolonged and devastating, with neither side able to achieve decisive advantages. The siege of Cusco by Atahualpa's forces in 1532 marked the climax of the civil war and the effective end of unified Inca resistance to external threats. The ancient capital, with its palaces and temples that embodied centuries of imperial achievement, became a battlefield where brother fought against brother using weapons and tactics that had been developed to expand and defend the empire. The symbolic impact of this fratricidal warfare was devastating, destroying the aura of invincibility and divine protection that had surrounded Inca rule. By the time Francisco Pizarro landed on the Peruvian coast in 1532, with his force of fewer than 200 men, the Inca Empire was already fatally weakened by internal conflict and epidemic disease. What should have been an impossible task for such a small force, the conquest of an empire containing millions of people defended by professional armies and sophisticated fortifications, became achievable because the empire was in the process of destroying itself. Pizarro was an experienced conquistador who had spent years learning about the empire he intended to conquer. He understood that the Spanish advantages in weapons and horses could be decisive in small-scale encounters, but he also recognized that military force alone would not be sufficient to overcome such a vast and well-organized realm. His strategy was based on the successful Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, which had demonstrated that indigenous empires could be toppled by capturing their rulers and exploiting internal divisions. The Spanish march from the coast toward the imperial heartland was a calculated gamble that exploited the chaos created by the Civil War. Rather than attempting to fight their way through hostile territory, Pizarro presented himself as a potential ally who might help resolve the succession crisis. His small force moved through regions where imperial authority had broken down, encountering little organized resistance from populations that were struggling with the effects of epidemic disease and civil war. The decisive moment came in November 1532 in the town of Cajamarca, high in the northern Andes, where Atahualpa had established his headquarters after his victory over Huascar. The Inca emperor, confident in his military superiority and curious about these strange foreigners, agreed to meet with Pizarro in what both sides understood to be a diplomatic encounter. The meeting was arranged to take place in the town's central square, with elaborate protocols designed to demonstrate imperial majesty while ensuring the safety of both parties. What happened at Cajamarca was one of the most consequential single events in the history of the Americas. The Spanish, despite being vastly outnumbered, had positioned themselves strategically around the square, with their horses hidden in buildings and their cannons trained on the space where the meeting would take place. When Atahualpa arrived with several thousand attendants in a procession designed to display imperial power and magnificence, he walked into what was effectively an elaborate trap. The immediate trigger for the Spanish attack was Atahualpa's rejection of Spanish demands that he convert to Christianity and acknowledge the authority of the Spanish king. When the Inca emperor threw down the Bible that had been presented to him, the Spanish interpreted this as both sacrilege and an act of war. The signal was given, and the carefully planned assault began. The slaughter that followed was brief but decisive. Spanish steel weapons and gunpowder proved devastatingly effective against opponents who were armed primarily with clubs, spears, and slings. The psychological impact of horses, unknown to the indigenous peoples of the Americas, created panic among Atahualpa's forces. Within less than an hour, thousands of Inca nobles and soldiers lay dead in the square, and the emperor himself was a prisoner of the Spanish. The capture of Atahualpa was a psychological blow from which the Inca Empire never recovered. The Sapa Inca was not just a political ruler, but a divine figure whose person embodied the connection between human society and cosmic order. His capture by a handful of foreign strangers shattered fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the protection offered by the gods. From his prison, Atahualpa attempted to secure his release by offering the Spanish a ransom that demonstrated the incredible wealth of his empire. He promised to fill a room measuring 22 feet by 17 feet with gold to a height above a man's reach, and to fill the same room twice over with silver. This offer, which represented wealth beyond the dreams of European avarice, was accepted by the Spanish, who saw it as confirmation that they had indeed discovered an empire worth conquering. The collection of Atahualpa's ransom became a process that revealed the full extent of Inca wealth, while simultaneously destroying much of the empire's artistic heritage. Gold and silver objects of extraordinary beauty and religious significance were stripped from temples and palaces throughout the realm and brought to Cajamarca to be melted down into ingots that could be more easily transported and divided among the conquistadors. The artistic loss represented by this destruction was incalculable. The Spanish chronicles describe golden gardens where every plant, flower, and insect was reproduced in precious metals with incredible skill and attention to detail. They tell of silver fountains that actually flowed with water, of golden walls that seemed to capture and hold sunlight, of textiles woven with threads of gold so fine that they felt like silk to the touch. But even more devastating than the loss of artistic treasures was the psychological impact of seeing sacred objects treated as mere raw materials. The Inca understanding of gold and silver was fundamentally different from European attitudes toward precious metals. For the Inca, these metals were sacred substances that connected the material world with divine forces. Gold was the sweat of the sun, silver the tears of the moon. To melt down religious objects made from these materials was not just theft, but sacrilege that violated the cosmic order itself. The ransom collected for Atahualpa's release was enormous even by Spanish standards, approximately 24 tons of gold and silver that made the conquistadors among the wealthiest men in the world. But despite fulfilling his part of the bargain, Atahualpa was not released. The Spanish had come to understand that as long as the legitimate Sapa Inca remained alive, they would face continuous resistance from his subjects who remained loyal to their divine ruler. In July 1533, after a show trial that convicted him of charges including rebellion against Spanish authority and the murder of his brother Huascar, Atahualpa was executed in the square of Cajamarca. The method of execution was changed from burning to strangulation at the last moment, after the emperor agreed to convert to Christianity in exchange for this small mercy. But the impact of his death was the same regardless of the method. The last legitimate Sapa Inca was gone, and with him died the divine authority that had held the empire together for centuries. The Spanish march on Cusco following Atahualpa's execution was less a military campaign than a procession through a realm whose resistance had been broken by the death of its god-emperor. Local commanders, uncertain of their authority without imperial guidance, often chose to submit rather than fight. Communities that might have mounted fierce resistance were paralyzed by the unprecedented nature of the crisis they faced. When the Spanish entered Cusco in November 1533, they found a city that was still magnificent, but already showing signs of the collapse that would follow. The great festivals had ceased with Atahualpa's death. The administrative systems that had governed the empire were breaking down as officials fled or were killed. The psychological bonds that had held together peoples from hundreds of different ethnic groups were dissolving without the central authority that had given them meaning. The Spanish established a puppet ruler, Manco Inca, a younger son of Huayna Capac, who they hoped would provide legitimacy for their rule while remaining subservient to their authority. But Manco was not content to be a figurehead, and his resistance to Spanish control would lead to one final attempt to restore independent Inca rule. In 1536, Manco Inca launched a carefully planned rebellion that came closer to success than the Spanish ever admitted in their official reports. Inca forces besieged Cusco for months, using siege techniques that demonstrated their ability to adapt traditional military methods to new challenges. The great fortress of Sacsayhuaman, which had been built to defend the capital against external enemies, became the center of indigenous resistance against the European invaders. The siege of Cusco was a desperate struggle that saw some of the fiercest fighting in the history of the Spanish conquest. Inca forces had learned to counter Spanish advantages in horses and steel weapons by fighting from fortifications and using tactics that negated European superiority in open battle. For a time, it seemed possible that the indigenous resistance might actually succeed in driving out the invaders and restoring Inca rule. But the rebellion ultimately failed because the empire that might have supported it no longer existed. The administrative systems that could have coordinated resistance across vast territories had been destroyed. The economic networks that could have supplied rebel armies had broken down. Most critically, the ideological foundations that had motivated people to sacrifice for the common good had been shattered by the death of the divine emperor and the apparent abandonment of the Inca people by their gods. When the siege of Cusco was finally broken, Manco Inca retreated with his remaining followers to the remote mountainous region of Vilcabamba, where he established a rump state that would maintain the fiction of independent Inca rule for another generation. This last remnant of the empire survived by avoiding direct confrontation with Spanish forces, while maintaining traditional Inca customs and religious practices in their mountain stronghold. The neo-Inca state of Vilcabamba was more symbol than substance, but it served important psychological functions for indigenous peoples throughout the former empire. Its existence proved that Inca resistance had not been completely crushed, that somewhere in the mountains the old way survived, and the gods had not completely abandoned their people. For the Spanish, Vilcabamba remained a source of concern and embarrassment, a reminder that their conquest was not as complete as they claimed. The final end came in 1572, when Spanish forces finally located and conquered the Vilcabamba stronghold, capturing and executing Tupac Amaru, Fa, the last independent Sapa Inca. His death marked the end of organized indigenous resistance and the beginning of 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule that would transform the Andes in ways that would have been unimaginable to the builders of Machu Picchu and the engineers who constructed the Great Road System. But even as the political structure of the Inca Empire collapsed, many elements of Inca civilization proved remarkably resilient. The agricultural terraces continued to feed Andean populations long after the imperial administration that built them had vanished. The road system, though allowed to deteriorate, remained the primary transportation network for much of South America until the coming of modern highways. The Quechua language, once the administrative tongue of empire, continued to be spoken by millions of people and remains widely used today. More subtly, but perhaps more importantly, many of the social and cultural patterns that had characterized Inca civilization persisted beneath the surface of Spanish colonial society. The concept of reciprocal obligation between rulers and ruled continued to influence political relationships. Community labor projects organized on principles similar to the ancient Mita system continued to build and maintain local infrastructure. Religious practices blended Christian and indigenous elements in ways that preserved core Andean spiritual concepts within new institutional frameworks. The architectural legacy of the Inca proved even more enduring than their social institutions. Spanish colonial builders, recognizing the superior engineering of Inca stonework, often built their churches and mansions on top of Inca foundations. Throughout the former empire, Inca walls still support modern buildings, their precisely fitted stones as solid today as they were 5 centuries ago. The rediscovery of Machu Picchu by Hiram Bingham in 1911 sparked renewed international interest in Inca achievements and began the process of scholarly investigation that continues today. Archaeological research has revealed the full extent of Inca engineering accomplishments while providing new insights into the social and religious life of the empire. Modern techniques have confirmed what early Spanish chroniclers found almost impossible to believe, that the Inca achieved their remarkable feats of construction and organization without the use of the wheel, iron tools, or writing systems as Europeans understood them. Perhaps most remarkably, recent research has revealed that many supposedly lost Inca techniques were never actually forgotten, but were preserved in indigenous communities that continued to use traditional methods long after the conquest. Modern engineers studying Inca stonework have found that contemporary Andean masons still possess knowledge of quarrying and construction techniques that were thought to have died with the empire. The textile traditions that produced the finest fabrics in the pre-Columbian Americas also survived the conquest, though in modified forms. Indigenous weavers continued to create textiles of extraordinary quality, adapting traditional techniques to incorporate new materials and motifs introduced by European contact. Today, Andean textiles are recognized worldwide for their beauty and technical sophistication, carrying forward artistic traditions that stretch back to the height of Inca civilization. The agricultural knowledge that allowed the Inca to feed their vast empire has proven equally enduring. Many of the crop varieties developed by Inca agriculturalists are still cultivated today, and modern research has confirmed the nutritional and environmental benefits of traditional Andean farming techniques. The potato varieties that sustained Inca civilization have become staple foods throughout the world, while quinoa and other indigenous crops are increasingly recognized for their potential to address modern nutritional challenges. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Inca Empire lies not in its material achievements, but in the vision of social organization that it represented. The Inca demonstrated that it was possible to create a political system that balanced individual needs with collective requirements, that honored local traditions while maintaining imperial unity, that achieved remarkable feats of engineering and organization through cooperation rather than coercion. This vision of society organized around principles of reciprocity and mutual obligation offers insights that remain relevant today. In an age when global challenges require unprecedented levels of international cooperation, the Inca example suggests that it is possible to create institutions that bridge cultural differences while respecting local autonomy. Their achievements in sustainable agriculture and environmental management provide models for addressing contemporary ecological challenges. The story of the Inca Empire is ultimately a story about the possibilities and limitations of human civilization. It demonstrates what can be achieved when societies organize themselves around shared values and common purposes, when technology is developed in service of collective well-being rather than individual accumulation, when political power is understood as responsibility rather than privilege. But it also illustrates the fragility of even the most sophisticated civilizations when confronted with challenges for which their experience has not prepared them. The Inca Empire fell not because of any inherent weakness in its institutions, but because it encountered forces, epidemic disease, steel weapons, horses, and fundamentally different worldviews that lay entirely outside its previous experience. The encounter between Inca and Spanish civilizations was one of the most significant cultural collisions in human history, comparable to contact between entirely different species of intelligent life. Each side possessed technologies, knowledge, and social institutions that were incomprehensible to the other. The Spanish had steel and gunpowder, horses and writing, but they lacked the agricultural knowledge, engineering skills, and social organization that had enabled the Inca to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. The tragedy of the conquest lies not just in the destruction it caused, but in the opportunities for mutual learning that were lost. Had the encounter occurred under different circumstances, without the pressure of Spanish gold hunger, without the devastation of epidemic disease, without the military advantages that made conquest seem feasible, the exchange between these civilizations might have produced innovations and insights that could have benefited all humanity. Instead, the conquest represents one of history's great losses, the destruction of a civilization that had achieved remarkable things and might have achieved much more, given the opportunity to continue its development. The knowledge that died with the last Quipucamayos, the architectural techniques that were forgotten when the master builders perished, the agricultural innovations that disappeared with the collapse of imperial research networks. These losses impoverished not just the Andean region, but the entire world. Yet something of the Inca vision survived, even the catastrophe of conquest. In the indigenous communities that maintained traditional practices, in the stones that still stand after 5 centuries, in the crops that continue to feed millions of people, in the languages and stories that preserve ancient wisdom. The golden thread of Inca civilization continues to weave itself through the fabric of Andean life. Today, as we face global challenges that require the same kind of long-term thinking and cooperative organization that characterize Inca civilization at its best, their legacy offers both inspiration and practical guidance. The terraces that still green the mountainsides remind us that sustainable agriculture is possible even in challenging environments. The roads that connected an empire demonstrate that infrastructure can be built to last for centuries when properly designed and maintained. The social institutions that bound together millions of people from diverse backgrounds suggest that unity and diversity are not incompatible goals. Most importantly, the Inca Empire reminds us that human societies are capable of remarkable achievements when they organize themselves around shared values and common purposes. The civilization that built Machu Picchu and maintained Tawantinsuyu was created by ordinary people who understood themselves to be part of something larger and more enduring than their individual lives. As we listen to the wind that still whispers through the ruins of Sacsayhuaman, as we walk the ancient paths that connected mountain to mountain and valley to valley, as we touch the stones that were fitted together by hands that understood the language of earth and sky, we connect ourselves with that golden thread that links past to present and present to future. The story of the Inca Empire, told in the patient voice of mountain streams and the gentle murmur of wind through highland grasses, reminds us that all human civilizations are temporary, but that the best of human achievements, the knowledge, the art, the vision of what society might become, can survive even the greatest disasters if there are people willing to preserve and transmit them. In the end, the greatest treasure of the Inca was not their gold or silver, magnificent as those riches were, but their understanding that human beings can create beauty and meaning even in the most challenging circumstances, that cooperation and reciprocity are more powerful than the competition and exploitation, that the earth itself can be a partner in human endeavor, rather than simply a resource to be consumed. This wisdom, hammered out over centuries in the thin air of high mountain valleys, tested by the challenges of governing an empire that stretched across one of the world's most difficult terrains, refined by generations of rulers who understood that true authority comes from service to the common good. This wisdom remains available to us today if we have the patience to listen to its quiet voice. As night settles over the mountains that still guard the ruins of ancient cities, as stars emerge in the thin air to shine with the same brilliance that guided Inca astronomers in their observations, as the silence deepens until it seems to carry the voices of all those who have walked these paths before us, we understand that some things are too precious to be lost entirely. The golden thread of human achievement, woven from countless individual lives dedicated to something greater than themselves, continues to gleam in the darkness, waiting for new hands to take it up and continue the work of creating meaning and beauty in an uncertain world. In remembering the Inca, we honor not just their specific achievements, but the eternal human capacity to dream of better worlds and to work together to make those dreams reality. The empire that once stretched from mountain peak to ocean shore, from tropical forest to desert coast, lives on in every act of cooperation and reciprocity, in every effort to balance human needs with environmental sustainability, in every attempt to create institutions that serve collective well-being rather than individual power. The Inca understood that true civilization is not measured by the height of its buildings or the extent of its territories, but by the quality of relationships between people and between human society and the natural world. This understanding, whispered now by the wind through ancient stones and carried still in the songs that echo through mountain valleys, offers guidance for our own time of challenges and uncertainties. The golden thread that connected the builders of Tawantinsuyu to the cosmic order they served connects us as well to the eternal human project of creating meaning, beauty, and justice in a world that offers no guarantees but endless possibilities for those wise enough to work together toward common goals. Let the gentle murmur of their memory guide us toward rest, carrying with it the promise that human achievements, however temporary they may seem, contribute to something larger and more enduring than the brief span of any individual life or even any single civilization. In honoring the memory of the Inca, we commit ourselves to continuing the work they began, weaving our own threads into the golden tapestry of human possibility that stretches from the deepest past toward a future we can barely imagine, but must never cease working to create.